Margaret Ashworth thought she was just saving a homeless boy from a cold car park. She had no idea she was actually bringing home her husband's biggest secret. She was 54 years old, she had raised one daughter who was now grown and gone, and she had a husband asleep at home who would later tell police, and then a judge, and then a documentary crew, that he had no idea who the boy was. Maggie did not believe in leaving people in car parks. She had grown up the daughter of a woman who fed every stray that came to her door, human or otherwise, and something in her chest simply would not let her start the engine and drive home. She asked the boy his name. He told her it was Ethan. She asked him how old he was, and he lied, and she let him, because she already knew. To understand why Margaret Ashworth was the kind of woman who stopped her car for a stranger's child at 11 at night, it helps to understand the 26 years that came before it. She and Roger had built a life in Adelaide that looked, from the outside and mostly from the inside too, like the quiet, unremarkable success story most marriages hope to become. A modest brick house with a well-kept garden. A daughter raised and married off with a wedding photo still sitting on the mantelpiece. A husband whose accounting career had provided steadily, if never spectacularly, and a wife who had filled the years around the edges of motherhood with part-time library work and a small circle of friends from her book club. Nothing in that life had ever prepared her to imagine that the calm, careful man asleep upstairs was carrying a secret large enough to eventually take the whole house down with it. Ethan's first night in the spare room was, by Maggie's account, almost unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that comes from a child trying to breathe as little as possible so as not to be noticed and asked to leave. She had left a towel and a spare toothbrush on the dresser without being asked, and in the morning found both untouched, the bed made with a precision that suggested he had learned somewhere that leaving no trace was the safest way to occupy a space that wasn't really his. It took 9 days before he used the shower without being told twice it was fine to do so, and 11 before he ate a full plate of food in front of her rather than picking at it and pocketing the rest. A habit Maggie recognized instantly from her own mother's stories of wartime rationing and never once commented on, because she understood, without needing it explained, exactly what kind of hunger teaches a body to hoard. What Maggie did not know, could not have known, sitting on the cold concrete in her cardigan, while a 16-year-old boy tried to work out whether she was safe to trust, was that she was looking at her husband's face. Not exactly, not obviously, but in the set of the jaw and the particular way his left eyebrow lifted when he was deciding whether to lie to her, there was something so familiar it would take her 4 more months to name it. She brought him home that night because the alternative was letting a child sleep outside in July, and Roger, woken at midnight by his wife walking a stranger's son into their spare room, said the thing that every man in this story would come to regret saying, "Fine, one night, and then he's someone else's problem." Ethan Voss had been sleeping rough for 6 weeks by the time Maggie found him, and the story he told her over the following days came out sideways, the way true things do when a child has learned that the truth gets him hurt. His mother, Renee, had died 2 years earlier of an illness he described only as the thing in her lungs, and after that he had bounced between an aunt who didn't want him and a group home he'd run from twice. He was 17 days from his 17th birthday, and he had, he told Maggie, exactly 1 photograph of his mother, and nothing else that proved he had ever belonged to anyone. Maggie listened to all of this at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel toward a stranger's child. A fierce, immediate, almost frightening need to make sure nothing else was taken from him. But to understand the secret Margaret found in that shoebox, you first have to understand the life Roger had spent 18 years paying to keep buried. Renee Voss, as the world would later learn from Ethan's own patchy memories and a handful of records Grace Whitlow pieced together for the guardianship file, had raised him alone in a series of rented units on the outskirts of Melbourne, working shifts at a hospital laundry that left her exhausted and, in Ethan's memory, endlessly apologetic for a life she never fully explained to him. She had told him, when he was old enough to ask, that his father was a man she had known briefly and who had never wanted to be found, a version of the truth technically accurate and completely incomplete. She kept a single photograph of herself pregnant, taken the year Ethan was born, tucked into a drawer he wasn't supposed to go through, and it was that photograph, retrieved from a shelter's lost property box after her death, that Ethan carried in his jacket pocket for 2 years afterward, like a passport to a country he'd never been allowed to visit. The day Renee died, Ethan was 14, and he has said the thing he remembers most clearly is not the hospital corridor or the nurse's careful voice, but the fact that no one from his mother's life beyond the two of them came to see her in her final week. No family, no old friends, no one who might have known who his father was and simply chosen, all those years, to say nothing. He was placed with an aunt he had met perhaps 3 times in his life, a woman who made it clear within weeks that the arrangement was temporary and reluctant, and by the time he ran from the second group home 18 months later, he had stopped expecting any adult to want him for longer than it took to find someone else to pass him along to. It was this specific expectation, more than anything else, that made the 6-week sleeping rough feel less frightening to him than it might have to another child. At least the street, he has said, never pretended to want him and then changed its mind. The 6 weeks Ethan spent sleeping rough before Maggie found him had taught him a version of survival most 16-year-olds never have to learn, which 24-hour service stations would let him sit near the heater without buying anything if he moved before the same staff member's shift twice in a row, which charity bins yielded warmer coats than others, and how to sleep with one arm always through the strap of his bag so that no one could take it without waking him. He had learned, faster than any child should, that adults who offered help usually wanted something in return, and that the safest thing to do with any adult kindness was to accept just enough of it to survive, and never so much that leaving would hurt. Maggie would spend months slowly undoing that particular lesson, one small act of unconditional care at a time, long before either of them understood how much undoing there would eventually be to do. Roger's reaction, in those first weeks, was not cruelty exactly, but a kind of coldness Maggie had never seen from him in 26 years of marriage. He came home late. He found reasons to be in the office on Saturdays. When Ethan sat at the dinner table, Roger ate quickly and left the room, and when Maggie asked him what his problem was, he said only that he didn't think it was their job to raise other people's children at their age. Maggie chalked it up to the ordinary friction of an unplanned houseguest disrupting a quiet marriage, the kind of thing she assumed would soften once Roger got used to the boy. She had no reason yet to imagine that her husband wasn't uncomfortable because a stranger's son was in his house. He was uncomfortable because his own son was. Whatever tension sat under the surface of the house, Maggie threw herself into the practical work of giving Ethan something that looked like a normal life, because she has said she has never known how to love someone without also trying to fix their paperwork. She spent 3 separate afternoons at the local high school arguing with an enrollment officer who wanted proof of guardianship Maggie didn't yet legally have, and she eventually got Ethan a provisional placement by sheer force of persistence rather than any document in her file. She bought him a school uniform 2 sizes too big on purpose, because he told her, quietly, that he'd rather grow into something than grow out of it and have to ask for another. She learned, in those early weeks, the particular vocabulary of a boy who had trained himself not to want things out loud, and she began, without ever naming it to herself, the slow work of teaching him it was safe to want things again. The first real crack in Ethan's guardedness came, according to Maggie, on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks in, when she was teaching him to make her mother's lamb and barley soup because he'd mentioned once, almost accidentally, that his mother used to make something similar. He got the measurements wrong twice and laughed at himself the second time, a real laugh, startled out of him before he could stop it, and Maggie has said she had to turn away and pretend to check the oven so he wouldn't see her cry at the sound of it. Lily met him for the first time 2 weeks later at a Sunday lunch she'd driven up for specifically out of curiosity about the boy her mother had mentioned 3 times in as many phone calls, and though the afternoon started stiffly, with Ethan answering questions in single words and refusing seconds he clearly wanted, by the end of it he and Lily were arguing amiably over a card game, while Roger sat at the head of the table saying almost nothing at all, a detail Lily would only understand the significance of much later. There was a sharper moment, too, roughly 6 weeks in, when Ethan borrowed a set of tools from the garage to fix a bicycle he'd found abandoned near the school, and Roger, arriving home to find the garage in disarray, raised his voice at the boy in a way Maggie had genuinely never heard from him before. not at Lily as a teenager, not at anyone. Ethan went silent and still in the particular way Maggie was beginning to recognize as his response to any adult anger. And it was Maggie, not Roger, who apologized to him afterward, though she has said she spent that entire evening quietly furious at Roger for a reaction that seemed wildly out of proportion to a borrowed spanner, without yet understanding that the anger had very little to do with tools at all. If you have ever taken in someone you barely knew because your conscience wouldn't let you do otherwise, you already understand the next part of this story, and you already know it rarely ends where you expect it to. Stay with this one, because what Maggie found in a shoebox 3 months later will change how you see every quiet husband you've ever trusted. Grace Whitlow, the caseworker who eventually got involved through the youth service Maggie contacted to make the arrangement official, ran a routine background check as part of the emergency guardianship paperwork, standard procedure for any minor being placed with a non-relative. It was Grace who first asked Maggie, almost as an aside, whether she and Roger had any connection to a woman named Renee Voss, because the file listed a deceased mother by that name, and a father listed only as unknown on the birth certificate, with a note that paternity had once been informally acknowledged but never legally established. Maggie said no, she'd never heard the name in her life. She said it with complete confidence because at that point it was completely true. In the weeks between Grace's offhand question about Renee Voss and the afternoon everything came apart, Maggie noticed a change in Roger she couldn't quite name at the time but would replay endlessly afterward. He started taking phone calls in the garage with the roller door half down. He grew short-tempered whenever the guardianship paperwork came up at dinner. And once, when Ethan mentioned in passing that his mother used to work in a hospital laundry, Maggie watched her husband's hand freeze completely still around his fork for a full 3 seconds before he resumed eating as though nothing had happened. She told herself, the way people tell themselves things they aren't ready to know, that Roger was simply stressed at work. It would be one of the last times she managed to convince herself of anything without evidence in front of her. There was one night, roughly a month before the shoebox, that Maggie would return to obsessively in the years afterward, turning it over like a stone she kept expecting to find something new underneath. Roger had come to bed late, sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time in the dark, and said, almost to himself, that there were things about his 20s he'd never told her, things he wasn't proud of, and that he hoped she'd understand he was a different man now. Maggie, half asleep and assuming he meant some ordinary premarital indiscretion, had reached over, squeezed his hand, and told him that whatever it was a long time ago and it didn't matter to her. She has said since that Roger went very quiet after that, and that she now believes it was the closest he ever came, unprompted, to telling her the truth himself, before he let the moment pass and, with it, his last real chance to control how she found out. The unraveling began with something almost absurdly small. A shoebox in the garage, pushed to the back of a shelf behind Roger's old tax files, that Maggie only found because she was looking for Christmas decorations in October, the way people do when they are trying to feel cheerful about something. Inside were photographs from a work conference in Melbourne, 17 years old by the date stamped on the back, showing Roger significantly younger, and a woman Maggie didn't recognize, laughing in a hotel bar, her hand resting on his arm in a way that colleagues' hands generally do not rest. There were 4 photographs. In the last one, the woman is alone, pregnant, smiling for whoever held the camera. Maggie sat on the garage floor for a long time before she understood what she was looking at, and even longer before she let herself think the woman's face looked like someone she had recently learned to recognize by name. Renee. She did not confront Roger that night. She would tell the documentary crew, years later, that she needed to be sure before she said anything that couldn't be taken back, because some accusations, once spoken aloud in a marriage, change the shape of the house forever, whether or not they turn out to be true. Instead, she did what any woman with a library card and a growing sense of dread would do. She requested Ethan's full birth certificate through Grace, using the guardianship paperwork as her reason, and she compared the handwriting on the informal paternity acknowledgement to a card Roger had written her for their 20th anniversary. She did not need a laboratory to tell her what she already knew by the third comparison. The letters leaned the same way. The R was formed the same way every single time. Before she said a word to Roger, Maggie drove 2 hours to her sister Diane's house in the Adelaide Hills, ostensibly for a weekend visit, and sat at Diane's kitchen table with the 4 photographs and the 2 pieces of matching handwriting laid out between them, needing someone else's eyes to confirm she wasn't imagining a connection out of exhaustion or paranoia. Diane, who had never much liked Roger in the quiet way sisters sometimes withhold opinions about each other's husbands, looked at the evidence for a long time and then said the thing Maggie had been unable to say to herself out loud, that she thought Maggie already knew and had known for weeks, and had simply been waiting for enough proof to make the knowing impossible to postpone any longer. Maggie drove home the next morning with the photographs back in an envelope on the passenger seat, and she has said that somewhere on that drive, watching the hills flatten out into familiar suburban streets, she stopped being afraid of what Roger would say and started simply needing him to say it. When Maggie finally sat Roger down at the kitchen table where Ethan had eaten dinner every night for 3 months, she did not raise her voice, because she has said since that she wanted to watch his face before he had time to build a lie around it. She placed the 4 photographs on the table between them and asked him one question. "Did you know?" Roger's silence lasted 11 seconds. She remembers counting them, and then he told her everything in a rush, the way people do when a secret has been sitting on their chest so long that letting it out feels almost like relief. Yes, he had known Renee. Yes, there had been an affair, brief, 17 years ago, ended before it became anything more than a mistake he had told himself he could bury. Yes, Renee had told him she was pregnant, and yes, he had paid her, quietly, for years, to stay away and stay silent, because he could not bear for Maggie or Lily to ever find out. He told her how it had started, because she asked, in a voice she has described since as strangely calm, almost clinical, as though some part of her had already stepped outside her own body to observe the conversation from a safe distance. Renee had worked a temporary reception job at the Melbourne conference where he'd been sent to represent the firm, 17 years ago, back when Lily was 7 and Maggie was home managing a household and a part-time job, and had not thought, even once, to wonder what her husband did with his evenings interstate. He described it, without much elaboration, as 3 nights that meant nothing to him at the time, and had apparently meant everything to the rest of his life since. When Renee called him 11 weeks later to say she was pregnant, he had told her, in words he now recited to Maggie with visible shame, that it would be easier for everyone if she simply disappeared from his life, and he had made that easier by attaching a monthly sum to the request. What Roger had not known, he insisted, was that Renee had died. The payments, arranged through a solicitor and never discussed directly, had simply stopped arriving at her end, and he had assumed, with the particular cowardice of a man avoiding his own conscience, that she had moved on and no longer wanted the money. He had not known that his son had spent 2 years bouncing through group homes and relatives who didn't want him. He had not known that the boy eating dinner at his own table for 3 months, the boy his wife had pulled off cold concrete behind a supermarket, was the 17-year-old secret he had spent nearly 2 decades paying to keep buried. Maggie has said in every interview since that this was the moment she understood the full cruelty of what had happened, not that Roger had a son, but that he had a son he was willing to let disappear rather than face. The days that followed the confession were, by Maggie's account, some of the strangest of her marriage, because life in the house continued in its ordinary rhythms even as everything underneath it had changed completely. She moved into the spare room that had briefly, absurdly, once been considered for Ethan before he'd settled into the room down the hall, and she and Roger continued to pass each other in the kitchen each morning with the stilted politeness of 2 people who both knew a conversation was owed, and neither was ready to have it. She did not tell Ethan yet. She has said this was the one decision from that entire period she came closest to regretting, not because keeping the secret a little longer was wrong, but because it meant Ethan spent 9 more days believing Roger was simply a distant, awkward houseguest in his own home, rather than the father who had known about him the whole time. If this story has made your stomach turn even once so far, imagine sitting where Maggie sat, a woman who had already fallen in love with a stranger's child, learning in the same conversation that the child was her husband's son, and that her husband had known, on some level, for months, and said nothing. Subscribe now, because the next 20 minutes cover what happened when Ethan found out the truth before either of his parents was ready to tell him. Ethan found out because Lily told him. Maggie's daughter had come home for a weekend visit, uneasy about the atmosphere in the house, and had overheard enough of a hallway argument between her parents to piece together the shape of what had happened. She did not mean to be cruel. She has said since that she assumed, wrongly, that someone had already told Ethan, and she mentioned it to him gently, thinking she was simply acknowledging what he already knew. The look on his face told her instantly that she was the first person to say it to him out loud. Ethan did not scream or cry in front of her. He walked out of the house, and for 6 hours nobody knew where he was. And Maggie has said that those 6 hours were the longest of her life, worse even than the moment she found the photographs, because this time it was a child she loved who was missing, and this time she understood exactly why he had run. Maggie spent those 6 hours doing the things a mother does when a child she loves has vanished, regardless of what any court document said about her legal relationship to him. She drove every street between the house and the school twice. She called the 2 friends Ethan had made in his few weeks at school. She sat in the car park where she'd first found him until a security guard asked her to move along, and she rang Grace Whitlow at 9 o'clock at night with a voice so unlike her usual composed self that Grace has said she knew immediately something had broken loose in the family that wouldn't easily be put back. Roger, for his part, sat at the kitchen table the entire time, according to Lily, who had stayed to help search, saying almost nothing, as though some part of him had already accepted that this was a debt finally being collected. Grace Whitlow found him eventually at the same Coles loading dock where Maggie had first found him, because trauma, she explained to Maggie afterward, has a way of pulling people back to the last place they felt in control of their own story. Ethan wasn't hiding from Maggie. He told Grace, in a voice she described as unnervingly flat for a boy his age, that he had come to the one place that had never lied to him. He had lived his whole life being told his father didn't want him, that his father was some vague, unnamed absence his mother refused to discuss, and now he had spent 3 months eating dinner across the table from that absence every single night without either adult in the house telling him the truth. He told Grace he didn't know which was worse, growing up without a father or finding one who had chosen, twice now, to let him vanish rather than claim him. In the counseling sessions Grace arranged for him over the following months, Ethan spoke rarely about Roger and often about his mother, as though the 2 griefs had become tangled together in a way he needed help pulling apart. He told his counselor, in a session Grace was permitted to summarize for the guardianship file, that the hardest part wasn't learning who his father was, but realizing that his mother had spent his entire childhood protecting him from a truth that turned out to be less painful than the not knowing had been. He began, slowly, to talk about her without the flat, guarded voice he'd used the night Grace found him, and Maggie has said that watching him learn to grieve his mother properly, months after her death, was its own strange kind of privilege, one she never expected a stranger's tragedy to hand her. Maggie brought him home again that night, the second time in 4 months she had driven to that car park to collect him, and this time she made a decision that would define the rest of the story. She told Ethan, plainly and without softening it, that whatever Roger had or hadn't done, she was not going anywhere, and neither, if he was willing, was he. She has said in interviews that this was the moment she stopped thinking of Ethan as a stranger's child she was helping, and started thinking of him as her own, regardless of what a birth certificate said about who his father was. Roger, for his part, tried to speak to Ethan that same night and was told, in language a caseworker later had to gently ask him to tone down for the paperwork, exactly what his son thought of him. It would be weeks before Ethan spoke to Roger again voluntarily. The marriage did not survive what came next, though not in the way either of them expected. Maggie did not leave because Roger had fathered a child outside their marriage 17 years earlier. She has said she might, painfully, eventually have found a way to forgive that, given enough time and enough honesty. What she could not forgive was the 18 years of silence that followed, the choice Roger made over and over again, year after year, to let his own son exist as an unspoken liability rather than a person, right up until that son was sitting in Roger's own kitchen, and Roger still said nothing. She told him, in the conversation that effectively ended their marriage, that she had spent her whole adult life believing she'd married a decent, if unremarkable, man, and that decent men do not calculate the cost of their own children in quiet monthly payments to a solicitor. Roger did not argue with her. He has said since that there was nothing left to argue. Roger moved out on a Thursday in April, into a rented unit closer to his office, and Maggie has said the strangest part of watching him load boxes into his car was how ordinary it looked from the outside, indistinguishable from any other marriage quietly ending after a long, slow drift, when in fact it was ending because of a decision he had made in a Melbourne hotel bar 17 years earlier, and every silent choice that followed it. Ethan did not come out to say goodbye. He watched from his bedroom window, Maggie has said, and told her afterward only that he wanted to know what time Roger's car finally left the driveway, as though marking the exact moment felt important. A boundary line between the version of his life where his father was a stranger in the next room, and whatever came next. The hearing itself, held 11 months after the night Maggie first found Ethan behind the Coles loading dock, ran longer than expected because the presiding magistrate wanted to understand exactly why a woman was seeking to adopt her estranged husband's biological son, rather than leaving the matter to Roger, who had by then indicated he would not contest it. Maggie's answer, given under oath and later described by court reporters as the most quoted line to come out of the Adelaide family court that year, was that a father's name on a birth certificate had never once shown up for Ethan at midnight, and she wasn't prepared to let a piece of paper decide who counted as family when she'd already spent a year proving it in every other way that mattered. The formal guardianship she had begun as an act of conscience toward a stranger's son became, within the year, a legal adoption of her husband's biological child, a fact the family court found unusual enough to require additional review before approving it. Grace Whitlow, who gave evidence in that hearing, told the court that in 11 years of youth casework, she had never seen a more clear-eyed application of the phrase, chosen family, than a woman formally adopting the son her husband had spent 2 decades trying to erase. The adoption was granted. Ethan took Maggie's surname by his own request, a detail that reportedly made even the presiding magistrate pause before signing the order. And Roger, present in the courtroom but seated apart from both of them, said nothing throughout the entire proceeding. Ethan was permitted, at his own request and with Grace's support, to read a short statement to the magistrate before the ruling was made, something Grace has said she had never seen a 16-year-old asked to do in over a decade of similar hearings. He said, according to the court transcript, that he had spent 2 years being told by circumstance that he belonged to no one, and that the woman sitting beside him had never once made him doubt he belonged to her, regardless of what any earlier paperwork had failed to say. He said he understood adoption was usually about starting a family that didn't previously exist, but that in his case, it felt more like finally putting a legal name to a family that had existed, unofficially, since the night she found him behind a supermarket. The magistrate, by all accounts, took a long pause before responding, and later noted in her written decision that she had rarely encountered a case where the law was so plainly catching up to a truth the people involved had already settled between themselves. Lily's relationship with the half-brother she had unknowingly helped introduce to the truth took longer to settle than anyone expected, not because she resented Ethan, but because she found herself grieving a version of her father she could no longer believe had ever existed. She has said in interviews that the hardest part wasn't discovering she had a brother, it was realizing that the man who taught her to ride a bike and walked her down the aisle had spent her entire childhood making monthly payments to keep that brother a secret, sometimes from a hotel room 2 suburbs away, while pretending to be at a work dinner. She and Ethan are close now, by all accounts, closer than most half-siblings who grew up in the same house, perhaps precisely because they found each other at the exact moment the family's oldest lie finally ran out of road. Roger Calloway has, according to people close to the family, made repeated efforts over the past 2 years to rebuild a relationship with the son he spent his silence protecting himself from, rather than protecting. Ethan has allowed some contact, a birthday message here, a stilted coffee there, but has told Grace Whitlow, who remained in touch with the family well past the closing of the case file, that he is in no hurry to call it a relationship, and no hurry at all to call Roger anything resembling a father. He calls Maggie Mum. He has said, in the one interview he agreed to give for this documentary, that he does not know if he will ever forgive Roger, but that he no longer needs to, because the person who actually showed up for him, twice, in a car park behind a supermarket, was never the one who owed him an apology in the first place. Every year on the date Maggie found him, Ethan takes out the single photograph of his mother he has carried since her death and sets it on the kitchen table for the day, a small private ritual Maggie has never asked him to explain and never intruded on, though she has said she quietly makes his favorite dinner on that night without being asked. He had the photograph properly restored and framed on what would have been Renee's 50th birthday, and it now sits on a shelf in his bedroom beside a second, newer photograph, Maggie, Ethan, and Lily, on the day the adoption was finalized, the three of them laughing at something just out of frame, which Ethan has told Grace is his favorite photograph in the world, not because of who is missing from it, but because of who chose, deliberately and against every easy alternative, to be in it. Ethan turned 18 this year, and Maggie marked it the way she has said she intends to mark every birthday from now on, with the lamb and barley soup he burned the first time he ever tried to make it, a cake from the same bakery that made Lily's childhood birthday cakes, and no mention at all of the father who sent a card 2 days late with $50 folded inside it, which Ethan put directly into a drawer without comment and has not spent. He has his provisional driver's license now, taught mostly by Lily on quiet Sunday mornings in an empty car park not unlike the one where his whole story began, and he has started talking, tentatively, about studying social work, telling Grace Whitlow once that he liked the idea of being the adult who shows up for a kid the way two women showed up for him, one of them by driving past 100 times too many people who didn't, and one of them by refusing to let a case file close until it was actually finished. Maggie Ashworth still works at the same community library. She and Ethan live together in the house she once shared with Roger, which she kept in the divorce settlement along with the modest superannuation split that came with 26 years of marriage. She has said, in the quiet, unshowy way she says most things, that she does not regret a single hour of the 3 months she spent taking in a stranger's son, even knowing now everything that hour set in motion, because the alternative, driving past a boy sleeping on concrete because it was easier not to know his name, was never really a choice she was capable of making. If there is a lesson in what happened to Margaret Ashworth, it may simply be this. Sometimes the family you build out of conscience turns out to be more real, more permanent, and more truly yours than the one you spent 26 years believing you already had. If this story moved you, kindly subscribe to our channel for more mind-blowing and emotional stories